The effects of climate change are already easily being felt around us, but people all over the world are responding. We're adapting to the changes, changing how we interact with the world, and inventing new technologies to reduce and repair the harms we've caused to our planet. Across the country, new institutions are opening dedicated to these efforts, including major new scientific research centers. Here in Houston, two new institutions are starting up at Rice that are both hoping to have real impacts on the world through their research and that will be able to clean pollution and mitigate climate change. Today, we're sitting down with the leaders of these institutions to learn about what they're doing and what they view as the most pressing challenges facing us in the future. I'm Weston Twardowski, an instructor and associate director of Rice University's Center for Environmental Studies and associate director of Eco Studio in Rice's Sustainability Institute. And you're listening to Gulf Streams on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM, where we talk with leading experts and community leaders to better understand the environmental problems and potential solutions facing our community. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Today I'm sitting down with the leaders of the new Rice University Water Institute, led by Dr. Pedro Alvarez, and the Rice Sustainability Institute, helmed by Dr. Carrie Masiello. Dr. Pedro Alvarez, Dr. Carrie Masiello, welcome to the program.
Good morning.
Thank you.
So just to start us off, I'm hoping you can introduce yourselves and your own work a little bit just before we dive into what these broader institutes are, and you can tell us a little about what you are in your positions as scientists.
Sure. I am Pedro Alvarez. I'm a professor of civil and environmental engineering, and I focus on water quality. I use nanotechnology and environmental microbiology to try to purify water in a manner that uses less chemicals that often cause collateral damage, and also try to minimize energy requirements to decrease the carbon footprint of the water sector.
Great.
I'm also a professor here at Rice in the Earth, Environment, and Planetary Sciences Department. And my research expertise is carbon in the sense of understanding the global carbon cycle with an application to thinking about how we can use natural processes to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. So how do we accelerate CO2 drawdown from the atmosphere through nature-based solutions?
And so this is helping to mitigate climate change.
Exactly. The major theme of my research is managing the atmosphere's CO2 pool.
Okay. And we've talked about it a little in the past, but I'm curious because I think you both have interests. What are nature-based solutions? Can you define that for us really quick?
Yeah. So a nature-based solution is a solution that takes advantage of natural processes already going on in the Earth system to lead to a climatologically beneficial or otherwise environmentally beneficial outcome. So an example would be growth of forests to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, or development of mangroves, expansion of coastal mangroves to protect cities from storms. There are a whole suite of potential nature-based solutions to the atmosphere's CO2 problem.
I imagine there's also a whole suite of nature-based solutions in the water space.
Absolutely. Nature has a tremendous assimilative capacity and natural attenuation capacity to degrade or immobilize a wide range of priority pollutants. But unfortunately, we exceed that capacity often, which underscores the need for technological innovation to solve these problems.
Well, I'm curious, and maybe we'll dive in there a little bit because I know that's been a focus of both the New Water Institute, and I should say both these institutes are pretty brand new at Rice. That said, maybe we'll start with the Water Institute because it did grow out of a different kind of project I think you've been running for many years. So do you want to talk a little about the Newt project and then what the Water Institute is?
Absolutely. Newt was an engineering research center funded by NSF with four...
The National Science Foundation.
Right, correctly, yes. And we have four academic partners, Yale, University of Texas at El Paso, and Arizona State University, 30 faculty labs in total, and perhaps more than 20 companies that participated in the use of nanotechnology to enable water treatment and reuse. And I think you all know that clean water can be a major limiting factor to human capacity, and we were focusing on enabling distributed treatment by creating this next generation of water treatment processes that would be small and easy to deploy, and that would have superior treatment capacity to tap unconventional water sources like seawater or wastewater for reuse. And we were pretty good at in this time at training over 170 graduate students, 33 of which are professors now. We published over 800 journal articles, generated 8 startup companies. So it was a pretty good innovation ecosystem that got world attention. And however, the challenges related to water quality keep growing because the demand for clean water is growing with an increasing population. Water pollution is increasingly more complex and more difficult to treat. You got PFAS, you got
Yeah, we had Dr. Michael Wong on a few weeks back talking about PFAS.
Right. And on top of that, as Kerry was implying, we got climate change exacerbating freshwater scarcity. So I am very pleased that RISE has decided to invest in this multidisciplinary effort to use clean water to protect human health, to enhance economic development and enhance prosperity.
Well, and I mean, that sounds like a wide fleet of problems that you're interested in or addressing or thinking about. And so is the purview of the new institute that broad? Are you thinking across all these, from pollution to scarcity to these myriad issues? And so I'm curious about, how that, especially having grown out of, more technical cleaning processes, which are really important, how that relates to this broader idea.
Yeah, we do cast a broad umbrella, but we actually focus on 3 areas. One is public health protection. Another one is in understanding the water footprint of the energy transition and helping decarbonize the water sector. And the third thing is resilient water infrastructure for cities of the future.
What does that mean? Because I think in Houston we have a lot of specific ideas about resiliency, especially around water. So can you walk us through that a little more?
Yeah, it may mean, for example, do some digital twinning of Houston's water distribution and treatment systems to do a network topology optimization to basically minimize energy requirements and the associated carbon footprint associated with water reuse. We think that distributed water reuse enabled by some new technologies is going to be the way to go to both enhance water quality and minimize energy requirements. But it's also, resiliency against climate change, which is going to be often bringing us more prolonged droughts, and we will have to begin to tap unconventional water sources, including wastewater.
I mean, that's something we've talked about a lot, is that kind of drought to flood cycle happening in Houston. And so I think everyone hears Water Institute and is kind of immediately aware of the ramifications of that, especially here in town, but certainly in the broader Gulf Coast and across the country. Yeah. Kerry, I'm wondering if you can tell us a little about the Rice Sustainability Institute and what some of the goals are there, maybe just starting with how are we thinking about sustainability?
For sure. So the goal of the Rice Sustainability Institute is to support the development of sustainable and equitable solutions to energy, environment, and climate challenges. And we really want to come up with solutions that have a global impact, but anchored in Gulf Coast problems. And we feel strongly that the Gulf Coast is a great model for the kinds of problem solving that needs to be done globally. And while it's not true that the Gulf Coast represents all kinds of cities and environments of the world, the Gulf Coast is representative of the kinds of cities globally that are at very significant risk. So we are hot and flat. And flat cities that are right on the coast are at serious risk of sea level rise or damage from storms. We're in a tropical, subtropical climate, and these tropical, subtropical regions are the areas where we're seeing the most population growth right now. And so we exist to enable and amplify globally relevant solutions that have this sort of Gulf Coast DNA to them. And so when we talk about a systems approach, what we mean is that we need to be balancing multiple dimensions of problem solving. So we need to be thinking not just about environmental solutions, but also sociocultural solutions, as well as commercial and financial solutions. So we exist to help identify, amplify, and build technological, cultural, and scientific solutions that do all of these things at the same time. They solve an environmental problem, they are sociologically, culturally relevant, and they make sense commercially and financially.
I think that's something that you're getting at there that I had wanted to bring up, and now it's kind of coming up organically, which is great, is this multidisciplinary approach, which you had mentioned as well, Pedro. And so I'm curious to hear more about these social, cultural elements, about these aspects that both of you are thinking with why it's not enough to simply be housed in engineering or simply be housed in earth science, right? But these are problems that actually demand really thinking across a wide array of disciplines, thinking about these problems as large, as you're saying, systems problems, and why that really requires a broad range of experts and, outside, not just academic partners. I don't think anyone thinks that the academy alone is going to solve climate change. And so can you talk to us a little about why that's so significant?
Sure. Yeah. So I want to first start by echoing something that Pedro said just a second ago, which is the importance of technological approaches. So I did begin by talking about nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions are going to play an important role in managing our climate change, our climate transition, but we can't solve this with nature alone. We also need technical solutions. We need technological solutions. And both nature-based and technological solutions require cultural acceptance to adoption. There is no path forward for any solution that doesn't involve recognition of the communities that they will be placed in and the needs of those communities. And those are going to be the community response to solutions is not going to be local, it's going to be hyper-local. So it's extremely important that we understand well how people react to change broadly and what kinds of change people are willing to accept. And that's a social science problem. But on top of that, we also have to work to help people envision a new world. So help people envision a world where change is possible and they can imagine changes that will make their lives better. Most of us are change averse, and we need the humanities, we need the arts, we need media to help us imagine how change can happen. And so within the Sustainability Institute, we support both technological, natural solution development, as well as thinking about these crucial sociocultural dimensions and how we can use the arts and the media to amplify and help us think about the world in new ways.
Well, I mean, someone over here who's based in the humanities, I'm excited to hear this, and certainly, I will throw out that our production is in part sponsored by the Rice Sustainability Institute through the Eco Studio Initiative. So, I mean, I have a certain degree of bias here of thinking this work is valuable, but I do think that's really important and significant. I know in different ways you're thinking about multidisciplinarity, Pedro, and so I'm wondering if you can talk some about your thought around multidisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, why these processes are so important in this work.
Yeah, first I want to echo the importance of getting input from social sciences and humanities in water technologies deployment. We need to understand what the showstoppers are, and they're not often techno-economical in nature. We need to understand what are the social barriers, but also the inequalities related to water reuse and water technology adoption. We need input for responsible deployment of capital, for revitalizing our infrastructure, which are still dealing with Victorian-era obsolete treatment processes, and there's a huge infrastructure expense, and how to deploy it in a responsible manner requires also social sciences input.
What do you mean by that responsible manner? I'm curious if you can dig into that a little more.
Well, there might be, for example, a tendency for quick solutions within a given election cycle and to pull off the shelf whatever is available and not be aware what's in the pipeline that could be a complete game changer. And perhaps by waiting a little bit and adopting a transition solution until a more sustainable and much more cost-effective technology is developed. So being aware of that, but it's also adopting and convincing a community has a huge cultural component to it. For example, if I am in the Mexican border, perhaps the person I need to convince for adoption is the grandma. And in a different country, in a different context, it might be a different person of the family or society that I need to be the first adopter. So getting, again, that input from sociologists and humanists is extremely important.
Well, and I think what you're also suggesting there is the importance of community buy-in, which is really critical in any of these projects.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think something, to go back a little to what you were talking about, Carrie, with the Gulf Coast, is, just to use this as a microcosm here, right? The problems that New Orleans and Miami and Houston are facing, all, fairly flat cities, all with certain things in common. I mean, New Orleans is really below below the grade, and so we're maybe the inverse of flat, even going into the earth itself. But that these are all cities that are facing at different levels very similar threats, and yet are very, very culturally different. Even the conditions on the ground, what looks like a possible solution for New Orleans or for Houston is nothing like what looks like geologically possible for Miami. And so I think that also speaks to really, it's one of these tricky things. We always want to imagine that any kind of big scientific question, any big question in general might have, well, here's our solution that's, scalable, as we tend to kind of love as a word, but also points that really thinking locally about these issues becomes critical to understanding how we can build up those relationships, that change is necessary with those community partners, and figuring out solutions that make sense to specific communities.
We absolutely will need a cornucopia of solutions. We'll need solutions that can be deployed in many different contexts. There will not be one magic bullet solution for climate change. There will not be one nature-based solution that everyone can implement. But what we need instead is plenty of solutions and plenty of technological and natural solutions and the skills to implement them in the context of the communities that we're talking about. And so, in particular, we imagine ourselves as being vulnerable to climate change here in the Gulf Coast. And that's true. We are. There are communities that are much more vulnerable than we are. We talk about the communities, the low-lying communities in Southeast Asia, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh. These are also communities in humid subtropical areas. And so it's important that we work in collaboration internationally with international partners to understand their needs and then to learn how any technological solutions that we can develop may be useful in a range of cultural contexts.
Pedro, I don't know if you want to talk specifically about the Gulf at all. I know you've got interests all over kind of the Americas, really. But if there are things that the Water Institute's particularly interested in at a more local level.
Well, yeah, I mean, the Gulf Coast is, of course, very important, and we would love to collaborate with the Sustainability Institute in their resiliency efforts, perhaps by enhancing access to seawater desalination in a more affordable manner, or recovering resources from wastewater as well. But with the city of Houston also, we are collaborating. Doran Stadler has been leading an effort in wastewater-based epidemiology, for example, that has been a great warning for pandemics to tell us when to put our guard up and when to lower it to minimize economic impact. That has been very important, and that continues in trying to develop pre-emergence detection and warnings and enhancing our prevention capabilities. Along, again, with the city of Houston, we are collaborating in making a digital twin of their water distribution system, again, to optimize water quality while minimizing energy requirements associated with supply.
How does the digital, understanding this digitally help us to do these things? It's always one of those interesting things of like, this is a really useful tool, but I don't understand how that works. So could you walk us through that a little bit as an example?
Sure. It's essentially a mathematical model of the water distribution system that can help you calculate the travel time from the water treatment plant to different taps. And the residence time is, of course, inversely related to water quality. The longer that it stays there, the more chance you have for microorganisms to begin breathing and opportunistic pathogens to reach your tap that we want to minimize. But you can calculate the friction and the energy requirement with that delivery. We spend easily 20 to 25% of our electricity moving treated water.
Wow.
And of course, if we were able to adopt a smarter grid, how should I say, with more distributed treatment and reuse, that water requirement, that need to move such a heavy commodity would decrease significantly. And that's one of the things that Chillingly is doing.
I mean, that also seems really significant. There have been a spate of stories I think listeners are probably somewhat familiar with around wastewater overflows that happen in the city, around private plumbing issues that are leading to really expensive charges to different local communities, especially Black and brown communities in town. And so I imagine that, understanding, having this kind of infrastructural map also allows us to really understand where there are risk areas, where there are places for potential improvement to improve overall health and quality of life for folks who are struggling with some of these infrastructural issues.
Yes, precisely. And another thing is also when we have power outages, our system is leaky, but at least it leaks out so that the water leaks out by the pressurized system. But when we lose power, then the pipes become empty, and then the leaks occur and then you got bacteria infiltrating our water supply system and people getting sick.
And this is where we get those boil water notices.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I'm seeing how this relates to these broader ideas and concerns that we're living with. I know both of these institutes are fairly new. You both really formally come online in the last 6 months-ish. And so this is maybe a bit premature, but I'm curious. I think you've outlined some of the larger priorities, but I'm curious if there are projects or things that you're really keen to get moving on, or if there are partnerships that are already forming that you'd like to share.
I'm particularly excited about the work going on in the area of geothermal energy at Rice. I think the potential for geothermal energy, not just...
Can you explain what geothermal is really quick for those who might not be familiar?
For sure. So geothermal energy involves using the heat that's present in the earth as a source of energy. And historically, geothermal energy has been tapped in areas that are close to tectonically active regions or near volcanoes, because there's a lot of heat at the surface of the earth in those areas. And one of the things that, in fact, Houston is really good at is accessing resources a little bit further in the earth. And so the potential for especially, I would say, both the payout in terms of access to affordable energy grid stabilization in Texas is great, but also geothermal, the development of geothermal energy, specifically in the Houston area, has the potential to allow a jobs transition of expertise in the oil and gas industry to expertise in a green energy generation system.
So, I think the common example people like to talk about with geothermal is, we've used this for thousands of years in the form of like hot baths, right? Like this is kind of the old historic example of how people have leveraged the heat of the earth into resources, going back pretty much as early as you can get in human history. You're talking about something far more technically specific here.
Oh, for sure. So there's a lot of different ways to get at the heat that's stored deeper in the earth, but generally the idea involves pumping water into the ground, allowing it to warm below ground, and then bringing it back up, and then using the heat in that water, for example, to drive a turbine or to heat greenhouses or to heat homes or cool homes with the appropriate exchangers. And I think the with the kinds of expertise that we have in Texas and specifically in the Houston area for working with subsurface resources. We really have a great potential for taking these newly developed technologies and translating them into jobs.
I mean, what you're saying is drilling, right? It's our connection to oil and gas who have pioneered some of the technology that makes some of this possible, right?
Absolutely.
And so, I mean, that's a natural partner. Houston is absolutely a deeply oil and gas town.
Mm-hmm.
And so as we think about energy transitions, yes, it feels automatically we would want to say, okay, where do these skill sets maybe translate? And so I think, yeah, that's clear as to how that could be a potential avenue.
As we think about sustainability,
Mm-hmm.
I mentioned that we need to be thinking about environmental, sociocultural, and commercial and financial stability. And anybody who has lived through the blackouts in Houston, we know that we need to have stable energy and we need to have readily available energy. And the wonderful thing about geothermal is that it provides energy whether or not the wind is blowing or the sun is shining. So it gives us that stable baseline that allows us to take advantage of wind and solar. And the three combined gives us the potential for going really green on our grids.
Yeah, that's really exciting. And so are there already partnerships in the works there? Are there already things that are starting up in that space since you say you're excited to get started on that work?
Yeah, for sure. So there's a developing team of researchers here at Rice, led by Jonathan Aho Franklin, who is working with a number of Houston area startups to expand both the scholarship and the deployment of geothermal energy in the Houston area.
That's exciting, yeah. Pedro, are there things that you're particularly keen to share with us that are starting up?
Sure. So we have a concerted effort exploring multiple technologies to destroy poly and perfluorinated chemicals, so-called PFAS.
Okay, there we go. All right. I was like, you lost me for a second, but PFAS. All right, that we're a little more familiar with. These are these forever chemicals that...
Exactly.
Yeah.
They're showing up in the blood of newborn babies. Mm-hmm. They are ubiquitous. They are by far the hottest topic right now when it comes to water quality and environmental pollution of any kind.
Yeah.
And
the EPA has been taking some measured steps recently to try to address some of these issues.
Yes, unprecedentedly stringent regulations that are going to be very hard to meet. And what people are doing right now, most municipalities and industries, is that they're removing PFAS by absorption. But they're just transferring the problem from one place to another, and they're not destroying them and eliminating liability. And
is this filtering, or
what's that?
Is this filtering PFAS? Or?
Yes,
okay.
by filtering or by ion exchange or by membranes, but you still end up with a concentrated, So we have come up with several catalytic processes that are very effective at destroying PFAS that are in the process of discussing this with the Department of Defense to perhaps establish a center of excellence in research. The other thing that we are very keen and very good at is about selective separations. And that
what does that mean?
Well, it may be, for example, recovering lithium from produced waters from the shale formations, or recovering other critical elements important to make batteries, to make catalysts, and that's something that we're making significant progress in. We're also doing a very good job of ecologically informed microbial control by, for example, to prevent the spread of antibiotic resistance from wastewater treatment plants using bacteriophages and other advanced ecologically informed approaches. So these are some of the things we're very proud of. Also, we have strengthened our collaboration with the Gates Foundation, and this is more about water reuse for underserved populations, including rural areas in developing regions of the world.
I mean, I think it's critical, of course, and those are going to be the areas that are going to be the most impacted by climate change. They're going to be at most at risk of climate change. But I mean, water reuse and water, access to water is going to be an issue that certainly hits developed nations, including the United States. We're already seeing access to water in the West is becoming a sticking point and is becoming a major concern in places like California and Arizona, and will increasingly be one in other parts of the country. So I'm imagining these are technologies that could be deployed in multiple contexts.
And also, I think that clean water technologies could be a very effective tool for diplomacy. for peace engineering, because as you know, as Mark Twain used to say, whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting over. Water is often the root of international conflicts, and this could be a way of making friends when we need them the most.
Well, and something that I'm hearing in a lot of what you're talking about in water reuse and thinking of lithium reuse and extracting these materials, some of which, certainly ties into recycling, but it does prompt me to think about sustainability, right? And thinking about these myriad ways that we utilize our resources, that we think about our resources as not single-use entities, as multifarious, as something that we have to protect and continue on. And so I'm curious if any of that resonates with the Sustainability Institute's goals, or how you're thinking about perhaps more circularity in some of our streams and ideas around what sustainability means and looks like. I don't know if that's a goal for the Institute right now, or if that's part of the thinking.
For sure. So, Weston, as you know, we Pedro and I came into this meeting in the middle of a planning conversation about a collaboration, and we'll end the meeting also with that conversation. But I guess I can go directly to the connection between geothermal energy and water. And so I mentioned that as you to harvest energy, you have to pump water into a geothermal well, and then you have to pull it out afterwards. And you can do that in a couple of ways. You can either pump fresh water in and then let it diffuse all throughout the pores in the rock and then pull that back up. But then when that water comes back up, it's full of the minerals and the compounds that are present in the rock. And that can be good and bad. It can be good if those are minerals you want to recover. And that's exactly what Pedro was talking about in terms of, for example, extracting lithium from brines. So for sure, that kind of circularity and recycling of multiplicity of problem solving, instead of looking at the water that comes out of a geothermal well as a potential source of contaminant in the environment, how can we look at recovering the materials that are in it and using them as the rare earths that are so important for our energy transition?
Well, and interestingly, I think in some ways that actually pulls us back to this kind of multidisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity conversation that really demonstrates these problems are not kind of solution oriented, right? That addressing any of these issues really requires understanding how it intersects and connects to other ongoing problems and how those solutions can actually accomplish multiple goals at once.
Oh, for sure. I think that's I don't want to speak for Pedro, but I think that systems approach, thinking about solving problems in a way that produces a multiplicity of benefits instead of solving one problem and creating another is going to absolutely be central to how we approach problem solving successfully in the 21st century.
Terrific. Is there anything else that you would like to hit on or to discuss? Or we're starting to hit the end of this, but we have time for if there's other points that I have not brought up you wanted to get across.
I just want to say that I think that RISE is doing the right thing and investing in these multidisciplinary research efforts that are working on the correct side of the decimal point, that can actually move a needle to consistently with our mission make the world a better place, more livable, improve food security, energy transitions, global health, and again, prosperity. So, kudos for President Reggie DeRoche.
I echo that. We've been given tremendous opportunities, I would say, in the last year or so to really join with the community and really imagine a better world. And it's a tremendous privilege and a tremendous pleasure to be able to do that.
Dr. Carrie Masiello is director of the Rice Sustainability Institute, and Dr. Pedro Alvarez is director of the Water Institute. Thank you so much for joining us.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
And now we're going to go to our researcher, Caroline Pollan, who has a fascinating piece all about coral reefs in the Gulf Coast. And we'll get to hear a lot about their health and what's happening and changing with climate change around them, but also some real signs of hope for how corals might be preserved for the future.
Hello, my name is Caroline, and I'm a researcher here at Gulf Streams. Recently, I was made aware of the incredible Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary, located way out in the Gulf of Mexico, about 150 miles from Houston. This marine sanctuary was designated as such in 1992, but reefs may have existed in the Gulf starting some 10 to 15,000 years ago. These reefs are actually some of the healthiest in the world due to the unique geology of the Gulf. They host almost 300 species of fish and more than 20 species of coral, an impressive display of biodiversity. Today, I'm talking with Kelly Drennan, who is the Education and Outreach Specialist at the Flower Garden Banks, about this amazing marine sanctuary. All right, welcome to Gulf Streams. Could you introduce yourself for our listeners and tell us a little bit about your role at the Flower Garden Banks Sanctuary?
Hi, my name is Kelly Drennan, and I am the Acting Education Coordinator for Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary. My job is to make sure that we communicate with the public about the sanctuary in whatever means possible, from doing educational programs in schools to doing community events to going out and doing presentations for local clubs and organizations to the website, the social media, interviews with radio, TV, etc., like this today, and just basically any kind of communication with the public to try and build awareness about Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary.
Awesome, thank you. So, coral reefs are these amazing ecosystems. They're some of the most biodiverse in the world. In addition to the coral, they support thousands of species of fish, and other ocean life as well, sponges, sea slugs, sharks, sea turtles. There's just so much diversity. That all depends on the structure of the coral. I was wondering if you could give some background on coral, what it is, and how it builds these huge reef structures.
Well, we need to start with the fact that there are many different kinds of corals. So the kinds you're talking about specifically are reef building corals, also
Mhm.
known as hard corals, hexacorals, stony corals, hermatypic corals. Those are all different terminologies for the kinds of corals that we think of as building the reefs that you go to snorkel on and visit, the Great Barrier Reef, the reefs off of Florida, and the shallow reefs at the Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary. So those kinds of corals are animals that have a symbiotic relationship with an algae. The animals look like little miniature sea anemones. They're tubular animals that are soft and squishy, that have one opening at the top and then a bunch of tentacles in multiples of 6 around the opening. Inside their tissues live these symbiotic algae, and that's what gives them their color. Otherwise, they'd be clear. These polyps reproduce by actually splitting and separating and duplicating themselves, basically cloning, and in that way build a colony. So each colony starts as a single polyp that then splits and divides and grows bigger. So corals grow upward and outward all at the same time as they're doing this by building a skeleton. And that skeleton is actually underneath them. A lot of people find that confusing because we know our skeleton is inside, but coral's skeleton is actually underneath. So when you look at a living coral out on the reef, only that top core in eighth to a quarter of an inch at the top is actually what's alive. That is where the coral polyps themselves live, and everything that's built beneath them is their skeleton. And what's really unique about these, their skeleton is actually stony, which is where the term stony corals comes from. The skeleton is made of calcium carbonate. So they're extracting calcium and other minerals from the seawater around them. And in conjunction with photosynthesis going on by these algae and other mechanisms within the coral, their biology allows them to create this stony skeleton underneath. And across the surface of the skeleton are these little tiny cups that each of the individual polyps sit in. So when you see a dead skeleton after the fact, you'll see all these tiny little circles across the surface, and that's where each of the individual polyps sat when this was a living organism. In the case of brain corals, it's a little harder to differentiate because you have all those channels and things. But if you really look down inside the channels, you'll find these little star-shaped clusters, and that would have been the base of each coral polyp within those little channels. So there are some corals that make bigger polyps. Most of the polyps we're talking about are maybe a centimeter across at best. But there are some types that build bigger polyps, and they're more observable polyps and more noticeable at different times. But the majority of the reef building corals have these tiny polyps that all work together as a colony to build this skeletal structure and build habitat for all these other animals.
That's so cool. I had no idea um, that the corals existed on top of their skeleton. That's amazing.
Yeah.
So I understand that the flower garden banks are a bit unique. Could you tell us what sets those reefs aside from reefs found elsewhere in the world?
So we are different in that we're a bank reef. If you ever learn about reefs in school, you learn there are atolls and there are fringing reefs and there are barrier reefs, but you never hear about these bank reefs. So all those others are associated with coastlines or a coastline that used to be there in the case of an atoll. It's where an island has disappeared in between, but there used to be a reef around it and that's what's left and might actually have land built up on top of it at that point. But a bank reef is just an isolated reef farther away from shore. And in fact, the Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary lies anywhere from 80 to 125 miles off the coast and consists of 17 different banks, but not all of them have these shallow coral reefs on them. So the two main ones are East Flower Garden Bank and West Flower Garden Bank. And then there is also coral reef, substantial coral reef at McGrail Bank, but that starts at 140 feet underwater, so beyond recreational dive limits. So when we're talking your typical shallow reefs, we're talking about those at East and West Flower Garden Banks, which are just two of the 17 banks in the sanctuary. The banks themselves are created by salt domes. These are pockets of salt under the seafloor caused by all that evaporation back when the Gulf was much shallower. All these salts settled down. Sediments then came back in over top as the Gulf filled in again over all these ice ages and unice ages and everything else in between. A lot of geology there. But basically, the salts were packed down underneath, and being less dense than the stuff over top kept trying to push upwards and eventually cause these little mini mountains basically out there on the edge of our continental shelf. And that's what we call banks. So these shallow coral reefs, and we call them shallow in reference to the others that we have out there, perch on top of these banks. And that puts them in the sunlit zone because corals require sunlight for survival because of those symbiotic algae they rely on. The algae need the sunlight to photosynthesize and create carbohydrates and other foods that feed the corals, and the process of turning CO2 back into oxygen and everything else. So these banks are isolated. They're out in an area of the ocean that is generally, it depends on where you are in the sanctuary, but around East and West Flower Garden Bank, it's about 400 to 500 feet deep. But instead, we have these little mountains that brought that bottom up closer to the surface. So they're in the sunlit zone, and our reefs perch right there on top, our shallow coral reefs. These reefs are still not only by location different, but by structure. So mostly we are dominated by big, huge boulders of coral that some of which are as big as small cars.
Wow.
And when you think about visiting, say, the Florida Keys or Cozumel, and you go snorkeling on a reef, you see these hard corals like brain corals and star corals and things, but you also see a lot of these flexible corals, this what we call soft corals, that are waving with the currents, and they're sea fans and sea whips and things like that. We have none of those on our shallow reefs. None at all. And scientists don't completely understand why that is. Maybe it's because of our isolation from other reefs, but we have only the hard structured corals on the shallow parts. We have some of those softer corals down the deep areas of the sanctuary, which make up our mesophotic or middle light reefs, so down the darker areas. But up in the shallow reefs, we have none of the soft corals, so that makes us unique. We're over 100 miles from shore. We're surrounded by open ocean water. And so all these things have blended together to give us kind of a unique environment that also puts us in a position where we're not as influenced by what happens on land. I can't say it doesn't happen, but it takes a lot more of runoff to actually get 100 miles offshore. We aren't as visited as closer reefs because it takes a lot of effort to get there. It takes us typically a 7-hour boat ride to get out there when we go out with our research vessel. So those are the main differences. We are more isolated and further off the coast, and we don't have any of those soft corals at the shallow depths.
That's so cool to know. Thank you. So on Gulf Streams, we've talked a bit about ecosystem services before, essentially how certain ecosystems benefit communities and contribute to a healthier environment overall. What ecosystem services can be attributed to coral reefs? Why do coral reefs matter?
Well, for those coral reefs that are close to the coast, they're providing a protective barrier to the coastline. They help prevent erosion. So they're taking a lot of the wave action, especially during storms, before it gets to, and extracting some of the energy out of those waves before they get to shore, which reduces erosion. In the case of the Flower Garden Banks, that is not the case. We are way too far from shore to make that kind of a difference. Although during big storms, waves do dip down that 60 feet down and affect things on the reef. They're still absorbing some kind of wave energy, but that's not really benefiting the coastline. But I think the biggest thing that people need to take away is that 25%, 1/4 of all marine life depends on a coral reef at some point in its life cycle.
That's
It
amazing.
might be that it permanently lives there. It might be that it hunts for food there. It might be that just some part of its life cycle is spent on the reef and then elsewhere, or elsewhere and then on the reef. So 25%, 1/4 of all marine life depends on coral reefs. So we lose our coral reefs, we lose that habitat, we are affecting the lives of 25% of all the life that lives in the ocean. And that can have a big impact on our economy because of fishing and other industries that rely on the ocean life, on what we eat, because we depend on foods and things from the ocean. And so it's a wildlife factory basically. When you look at a coral reef, it's actually helping to produce more wildlife or supporting more wildlife than most any other habitat out there in the ocean.
Yeah, so this ties into what I wanted to talk about next. So, coral reefs are unfortunately one of the most endangered ecosystems on the planet, in the face of human impact. What would you say are the biggest threats to worldwide? And do you see these threats impacting the flower garden banks?
The biggest threat right now is climate change. Corals live within a very limited temperature range. Each reef is a little bit different from the one next over, but for the flower garden banks, that's basically 68 to 84 degrees Fahrenheit. And when temperatures get outside of those ranges, either too cold or too hot, it puts stress on the corals, and that's when you end up with these issues called coral bleaching that you hear about a lot lately, right? And coral bleaching is when the corals kick out the algae that live in their tissues. They lose that symbiotic relationship, and that's where more than 3/4 of their food supply comes from. So then they're stuck just catching things with their tentacles, which is not nearly as effective as photosynthesis. And they're basically starting into a starvation mode. That's called coral bleaching because when the algae leaves, so does the color from the coral. So they're clear without them, and you see through to their white skeletons underneath, so it looks like they've been bleached. But a bleached coral isn't necessarily dead. It has a chance to recover if the temperature range that's been affecting it and stressing it out and causing the bleaching to take place is corrected, and then it can take on new algae or remultiply whatever's left of their symbiotic algae and then go back into a healthier state. But just like people, anytime you are sick, when you go through a stress event, you are more susceptible to disease, you're not as energetic, you're not as capable of other things as you were before being affected with those serious stress events. So coral bleaching is not a good thing. It's happening all over the globe. Coral reefs are really suffering from the heat waves we've been having. Last summer in Florida, water temperatures got over 100 degrees. Water temperatures, not just air temperatures. And with all the work they've been doing to restore the coral reefs in Florida, they actually had all these nurseries in shallow water areas growing more corals to plant back on the reef. And even those nurseries were killed off because the temperatures were just so extreme. Our reefs are somewhat buffered from that because they are 60 feet below the water at their shallowest point. There's very often a 3 to 4 degree temperature difference between the surface and the reef depth, which means that we don't start into the bleaching temperature ranges as soon as other reefs. So Florida started in June last year. We got there in August. We don't usually get there till September. So we were ahead of schedule last year. Well, Florida this year is already ahead of schedule from last year. And so that means that we probably will be too, and that we're likely to see bleaching again. And if bleaching occurs again this year, that'll be the first time in the history of the flower garden banks, since we've been watching over them, that we have back-to-back bleaching events. And that is not good. That means our corals do not have adequate time to recover. You know, if you have the flu and you come back from that, even when you're healthy again, you still take weeks before you're 100%. Well, our corals, after a major bleaching event, need that whole next year of recovery and so forth. So if we go at them again and have another bleaching event, then that's really trimming back their ability to recover from these extreme experiences. And unfortunately, climate change projections, if temperatures continue rising at the rates they are now, they're projecting that the flower garden banks will start seeing annual bleaching by 2040. And that's only 16 years away.
Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas right now, the shallow coral reefs at Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary are the healthiest coral reefs in the entire Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico. and they could possibly be the source of stuff to help restore some of these other reefs. And so that's where we're in real danger. If we hurt the healthiest reefs, then the other reefs lose some of the potential material that could be helping them recover. Now, everybody has a way of influencing climate change by how much carbon they produce through driving a vehicle, through running a lawnmower, to breathing for that matter. I mean, technically, we're all producing CO2 every day, right? But it's how we, we can't limit our breathing. We don't want to do that. But we can limit the way we use transportation and use, electric lawnmower maybe instead of a gas powered one, and try and limit our carbon X how much carbon we're putting into the atmosphere, because all that eventually soaks into the ocean, and it's affecting temperatures, it's affecting how sea creatures can build their shells and so forth. But everybody's like, well, but I'm only one person. The fact is, you may be only one person, and your little bit might be just a little bit, but together we're millions. And that's a lot of little bits together that make a big difference. Aside from climate change, I would say the next most important thing that people need to be aware of as far as how they affect coral reefs is the water quality. The ocean starts at your front door. Water falls from the sky, flows off your land, into storm drains, into nearby rivers, lakes, bayous, bays, and eventually out to the ocean. At some point, that water that you're seeing come down from the sky ends up in the ocean, but it picks up things along the way. So the fertilizer in your yard, the oil droplets on your driveway from a leaky oil pan on your vehicle, all these different things can drain off and end up in the ocean. And so I always tell people, the most immediate thing you can do is take care of water and be careful about what goes into it and how much of it you use, because everything we use is also coming out of those sources. And that means less is getting to the ocean, and that is also affecting the salinity of the ocean. So all of these things all cycle together, but those would be probably the two biggest things I think is climate change and the heat stressors that we're facing right now, as well as, everyday water usage.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's a complicated problem, but
Yes.
as you mentioned, our fisheries and our oceans depend on coral reefs, and they're a vastly important ecosystem that we need to focus on conserving. My last question is not super related. It's a little bit of a lighter question, but
Okay.
have you ever had the opportunity to dive at the Flower Garden banks?
Yes, actually, that's been a part of my job from the get-go.
That's amazing.
So even though I'm the education outreach person, I used to lead a teacher workshop that took teachers out diving. And in order to do that as a NOAA employee, I had to be certified through NOAA that I was okay as a diver and could be, that they could cover me for that. And they were willing to, that I had the skills for that. So I had to take courses, I had to be tested, I had to go through physicals, all these different things on every so many years for some things and every year for other things, and maintain my skills, improve my abilities. And so work said, well, if we're going to do that for you to go out on a teacher workshop once a year, we're going to use you in other places too. I said, good, let's do that. So usually, 2 to 3 times a year, I would get out there with the research team. And so I have helped with long-term monitoring efforts. I've been out there to help install mooring buoys, and sometimes I'm just holding stuff and handing things off to other people. But instead of just teaching about things from what our divers tell me, our researchers tell me, I am actually out there experiencing it firsthand. So I've had, up until COVID, I was diving. I'm not diving for work anymore. I've taken on additional responsibilities and just don't have time to keep that in there too. But, the better part of the last 20 years, yeah, I've been part of the dive team at the Flower Garden Banks and had the beautiful opportunity to go diving out there. And even before I worked for them, I went diving out there as part of that workshop. I was a participant in that workshop before I was teaching it. And my first dive, I had 2 manta rays before I got to the bottom. My very second trip out there, and each trip out there is multiple days because it is a long trip. And so you stay on the liveaboard boat and stay out there for a couple days or so. My second trip, a month later, I saw a whale shark. So I have had fantastic experiences, and it was those first 2 experiences at the Flower Garden Banks that made me say, if you ever have another education position, I surely would be interested. And in 2004, I got the chance. So I have been with the sanctuary for almost 20 years now.
Oh my gosh, that is amazing. That just sounds so incredible.
It
Yeah.
is. It's been a very unique opportunity and nothing I ever expected when I went off, left high school and college and went off to find a career.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. This has been really informative and just a pleasure. Thank you so much.
You are very welcome. And almost everything I talked about today is up on our website, especially we have a great page on coral basics that talks about all the coral biology. We also have email lists people can sign up for if they want to get regular news from the sanctuary. And there's a page about that on our website. We're on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and X.
Yeah, thank you so much.
For this week's How to Get Involved, I'm going to recommend that you visit houstonwilderness.org and sign up about their volunteer opportunities. They're a nonprofit group locally in town that runs volunteer opportunities throughout the year, especially around planting native grasses and trees and other really important parts of our ecosystems that help with flood retention, but also to promote biodiversity in the community. So if you're interested in getting your hands dirty, going out, planting some really great plants for our local community, I would suggest going to houstonwilderness.org/volunteer-ops and signing up to learn more about their volunteer opportunities. Next time on Gulf Streams, we'll be talking all about moving because of climate change, or what's called managed retreat, and how communities can lead the way in where they go next. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure that you never miss an episode. And if you have questions or ideas for what you'd like featured on Gulf Streams, leave a voicemail at 713-348-4081 or email us at westonT@rice.edu. Gulf Streams is a co-production of KPFT Houston and Rice's Center for Environmental Studies, with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Rice Sustainability Institute's Eco Studio. Produced by Weston Twardowski, co-produced by Joseph Campana, audio engineer Rico Enriquez, research support provided by Jaden Bray-Boyce and Sienna Yen. Stay tuned for the R&R Show with Ronnie Renfro and Tom Richards here on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM.